Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our continuing discussion of imperialism in the late 1800s, right? So, big thing about it is we left off right here for all those people that actually missed the sudden impact day, right? Okay, I think it's awesome that y'all had that opportunity to go and stuff like that, but you didn't really miss a ton of stuff, right? We had a really big moment in class where apparently we remembered and triggered something from geography last year when y'all looked at this very important political cartoon of Otto von Bismarck cutting up a cake that said Africa on the side of it, right? And we talked about that and actually related it to what we were talking about in class now. That's what Mr. Wooderson was teaching you, was this period of time known as the scramble for Africa, right? This disgusting period of time where Europeans literally were basically in a race to see who could actually gobble up territories in Africa that strictly and 100% did not belong to them whatsoever, to try and take advantage of a lot of different resources that were discovered in the interior of Africa, including rubber, ivory, diamonds, palm oil, copper, gold, and a massive amount of other things, right? Now, to try and avoid war, what is going to happen is Otto von Bismarck is going to hold a very large meeting known as the Berlin Conference, held in Berlin in 1884 outside of the Reichstag building. And what's going to happen is they're going to actually literally decide who gets what areas of Africa, turning Africa from this into this, right? And so the thing about it is only two countries in Africa, only two countries in Europe and Africa were actually able to avoid being imperialized by the Europeans. And they're the modern day countries of Liberia and Ethiopia, right? Those two countries were the only ones that were able to avoid being imperialized. One, because like Liberia was actually started by former freed slaves from the United States and had an American charter. And then also because the Ethiopians were able to use their territory to actually fight off the Italians who tried to come in and imperialize them, right? So the thing about it, though, going into it, is there's going to be massive effects of the scramble for Africa and the imperialism of Africa on the Africans themselves. We're talking about a lot of really intense, very heavy things today, right, in this flip. So it's important that you pay attention and understand that the effects of imperialism on the native people of places like Africa, Southeast Asia, and other areas of the like is going to be very, very important in our discussions going forward. Also, really quick update as well, your test date, I'm not positive when it's going to be. I know it's going to be after like Easter, and we'll be in that week we come back. I just haven't really figured out which day yet, okay? But I will keep you on tabs, and I'll keep you up to date as much as I possibly can, right? But the big thing about it is let's keep going with our discussion of the imperialism of Africa, right? So we now have to talk about the major effects of the imperialism of Africa. Some of these things we'll spend a lot of time talking about. Some of them we will not, right? So the big thing about it that we need to understand is that the imperialism of Africa is going to cause so many different cultural, ideological, violent changes onto the African people. And it's going to be a very, very important thing that we discuss and actually relate and compare these things to the effects that were similar onto the people of Southeast Asia as well, and then also in different areas like South America, right, in the Guyana states. Now, going into it, though, some of the biggest things that's going to actually be pretty ubiquitous throughout all areas that are actually going to be like taken over by Europeans is going to be the forced conversion to Christianity, right? So this goes hand in hand with that disgusting motivation for imperialism known as social Darwinism, or as the French called it, mission civilstrace, which is like the civilizing mission, which is absolutely nasty and disgusting. It's like they didn't need you to force Christianity onto them whatsoever. They had societies all their own, religions all their own, and all of these different motivations. They did not need missionaries to come to them and convert them so that they could feel like they were doing a good thing, right? So the thing about it going into it is Christian conversion is going to be really, really big, especially in Southeast Asia, here in a few minutes when we get into talking about India, because they had a very sophisticated religious structure through Hinduism and Buddhism that is going to have massive effects and pushback against the forced conversion of Christianity. Now, it did happen in Africa as well. And then also another big effect of imperialism in Africa is going to be the fact that Africans and African societies are going to resist, right? Like when we talked about Henry Morton Stanley in class, this awful individual who was like in task with finding the source of the Congo River and stuff like that, which actually he found out that actually none of it has really a source, that the Congo River actually has multiple different rivers that converge into one larger river and different tributaries that form this massive river, which is one of the largest rivers in the world, that they actually use to harvest and mine ivory and gold and rubber and things like that out of the Congo state later on. He is going to actually be absolutely terrible in his discovery process. He actually apparently in his diaries claimed that he used Native Africans as target practice while he was literally trying to traverse the African, like the Congo River. He also had like many different porters die during these different expeditions because he worked them practically to death. Well, Africans are going to resist this. When they start hearing about all this stuff, of course that they're going to try and stand up for their brethren, for their countrymen, well, not their countrymen, but for the people that are native to these like lands and things like that, and try to stand up for their culture and their people. Now, this is going to be a very, very particularly big struggle due to the fact that the Europeans simply had technology that the Africans did not have. There apparently was one particular situation in the late 1800s when 5,000 African soldiers, 5,000 African tribal soldiers armed with shields, spears, and like more like tribal defense weapons are going to go up against 50 British guys with 4 Maxim guns. And not a single one of those British individuals died. None of them were injured because they had Maxim guns that could fire over 200 rounds per minute, firing into a crowd of 5,000 people, right? And the thing about it is that this was just a demonstration of the massive military technological leaps that the Europeans had, the Africans simply did not, right? So there's an even disgusting poem that came out that the Brits used to publicize in a lot of different things because people back in Great Britain were concerned about this African resistance, and the Brits used to use this poem to basically say, "Fear not, we'll be okay." And it's really gross because it's saying that, hey, don't worry, we've got this gun and these people do not. And the poem goes, whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun and they have not, right? Which is absolutely gross and a tagline of imperializing a group of people that you had no business taking over, right? Now, also, there's going to be fighting between Europeans over African lands that will actually sweep Africans into it as well. The Boer Wars is a big example of this. When Cecil Rhodes, a British explorer, discovered diamonds in the Transvaal state and the Orange Free States that had originally belonged to these people known as the Boers, which were leftover Dutch settlers from when they were trying to get around Africa to get to India, creating their Dutch East Indian trade routes. The Boers were like farmers that actually were of European descent and were what you would call like Europeans by descent. They farmed those different areas, and the Brits wanted to take that land away so they could begin the mining of diamonds and gold, right? So what's going to end up happening is a massive war between the Boers and the British, right? And the British are actually going to develop the use of concentration camps against the Boers and things like that. And actually a woman named Emily Hobhouse became a very, very large proponent of ending this and exposing it to people back in Great Britain, right? So the thing about it is you're going to see even wars between like European people over these lands that they're fighting over that never belonged to them in the first place, right? And also you're going to see the enforcement and dissemination of racist ideologies where Europeans will show up and begin to impress their values, their culture, their ideals, their things onto African people because they believed genuinely that they were more superior, which we already know is not true whatsoever, that it is not a question of scientific superiority. It's a question of historical progression, right? So it just happens to be the fact that Europeans had an industrial revolution where the Africans did not, right? So going into it as well, there's also going to be levels of genocide, right? Now, genocide being efforts of deliberate or undeliberate extermination of people in a general population. Now, a Holocaust is the actual complete attempt to kill off a group of people. Genocide is just large-scale murder, right? Now, the biggest example of genocide that actually occurred in Central Africa is the Belgian conquest of the Congo, where this man right here, who deserves to have his name written next to some of the most horrible people in history, is known as Leopold II. Literally in African communities, in some sub-Saharan African communities, they consider this man to be the most evil person in all of history. Actually, interestingly enough, some Africans actually even went further on later on and named their children Adolf because they thought that that was a strong name because he was able to take over so much land and military. They were hoping by naming their children this that they would be able to undo the things that Leopold had done. If that kind of shows you how messed up this individual was, right? Leopold II was the king of Belgium during the late 1800s going into World War I. Now, Belgium was a constitutional monarchy. This guy wanted to be an absolute monarch. So he wanted to try and find territory that he could rule with an iron fist. And that area that he ended up finding and convinced all these other European powers to give him charters to was the unindustrialized area in the middle of Africa known as the Congo, right? He's the guy that sent Henry Morton Stanley to find the source of the Congo River. And he began importing things like ivory, gold, and eventually rubber would be the biggest thing that he actually began stripping from these African lands. He sanctioned the use of military squads to go in and hold African family members hostage from one another to force them to gather rubber and ivory. He did all of this while having people worked to death to build railroads and also ferry stations and different areas to actually use to extract different goods and materials from the insides of Africa. And as you can see right here, this is a very famous cartoon that came out of the West African press that we'll talk about here in about 2 seconds. And as you can see, it says, "in the rubber coals," right? And literally because Africans had to harvest the rubber in the Congo from rubber vines, right? And so this is actually attributing the idea that the Belgians and King Leopold are there strangling the families of Africans, right? And this African man being strangled to death by this creature, this rubberized actual snake who is coming there to destroy them, right? Now, going into it as well, he actually even sanctioned the use of soldiers that were harvested from Africa, so African soldiers that would be given guns and weapons to suppress other Africans with. They were known as the force publique. And the force publique was told never to use these guns unless it was on a person, but you're giving it to an African man. Regardless of the uniform you're getting him to wear, regardless of the things that you are giving him, you're giving this to an African man who is from a tribal society. So obviously they would sometimes want to use these guns to hunt with. Well, the Belgian authorities told these force publique soldiers that if you shoot someone, I'm giving you 10 bullets, right? So if you come back with 9, you better come back with proof that you had actually shot a person with it, not an animal for the use of hunting. So literally what this forced force publique members to do, and what force publique members began to go around to do, is they began to cut the hands off other Africans to try and come back with, to show that they had shot a person rather than an animal with it. So you literally, this practices like this in the Belgian conquest of the Congo, the forced extraction of rubber, the force publique soldiers, starvation, level famines, also hostage negotiation tactics that were used by the Europeans led to the death of 10 million people in the area of the Congo, right? And this is deaths mostly over rubber and ivory. If this subject is something that you would like to look more into, there's a very, very good book by a man named Adam Hochschild, and it's called King Leopold's Ghost. I'll put a link to it down in the description if you actually want to read more about this, right? So the big thing about it, though, going into it as well, is so you're talking about things on the level of the Holocaust in terms of genocide that people have not talked about for a long period of time, because that's the thing is that this is European imperialism, right? The late 1800s is a very messed up time in European history. And another big example of this is India as well, and how the British are actually going to go in and colonize India completely and bring it into their society as a colony that they would refer to as their crown jewel, okay? So the biggest thing about it, and we have to travel backwards in time a little bit, is that we've been talking about India and Europeans' involvement in India for quite some time. We've been talking about it since 1497. 1497 is going to be when Vasco da Gama goes all the way around Africa under the Portuguese sailing ships and actually are looking to try and get into Indian spice trade. And in 1497, Vasco da Gama gets past the, at the time, Cape of Storms, renames it the Cape of Good Hope, and gets all the way to India and begins the Portuguese colonization of India. Now, the Portuguese are going to begin setting up coastal forts all over the outside of India. Now, at the time, the Indians were led by this group called the Mughal Empire, as well as a lot of different separate states and landlords that actually owned the land, right? So the thing about it is that they're going to show up, and the Mughal and then also the other lords that lived there and stuff like that felt as though it's look, you can try your best or whatever, but there's no way, because you can't avoid getting malaria if you try to push into India. And also, if you try to take anything else from us, we'll just simply stop trading with you and stuff like that. But the thing about it is that the Portuguese are going to start showing up to the ports of Europe bearing tons of black pepper, which actually could make people tons of money. It was a symbol of status in the 1500s, right? Now, the colonization efforts of these other European countries are then going to kick in immediately after that, right? So since the other European countries like the Netherlands, the French, and the English see all these goods coming into Portuguese ports, they begin to then found these sovereign companies called the East India Companies, and they send the boats there to India to try and create influence of their own, right? So the thing about it is, when the British get there, originally they had actually started out in the East Indies, which are the islands off the coast of India, but then they're going to start trying to practice this process known as indirect rule over India. So the British are going to actually send emissaries to India, and begin to bribe and actually take over different plots of land in India. They're going to buy them from local lords and stuff like that, because something you need to understand about India at the time is they weren't a contiguous country led by one person. They were literally different states and landlords and different areas owned by different rich individuals. So literally the British went in and took advantage of this, and particularly in northeast India towards Nepal and Bangladesh, and they went into those areas and began to buy up different plots of land and practice a system known as indirect rule. Now, indirect rule is when you leave local Indian leaders in charge and you pay them to enforce the farming or the harvesting or the manufacturing of certain goods you want, right? Because there was less than 1,000 British people in India during the 16 and 1700s, helping rule over a population of upwards of 300 million Indian people, right? So they actually would leave a handful of British officers there in charge, a few East India Company boats, and then they would actually get the local Indian rulers to rule over things for them. Now, many upper class Indians are going to benefit from this early on. Early on in pre-1850, when the British were getting involved, these upper class Indians that they were bribing and stuff like that benefited off of this, because it's going to help them destroy this old system known as the caste system, right? Which is related to Hindu religion as well as to societal class structures in India. So what the caste system was in Indian religion is basically that there were 5 castes that existed in society: the Brahmins, the Kshitras, the Vaishyas, the Shudras, and the Dalits, right? Now, when you're looking at these different castes, it's how Indians kind of used a system to explain where you were in society, right? So Brahmins were the closest to God, right? Because their god in Hindu religion was known as Brahma, that all the other deities and sub-gods were at one singular part of. And eventually the idea was that if you led a good life, you would be reincarnated as a class above the one that you actually started at. Y'all talked about this in human geography as well. The Ganges River being related to this, and how they would pour the ashes of people into the Ganges River, and how people literally at one point used to even bathe in the Ganges River, and how then by the time the British are going to take over, it's going to be full of pollution and things like that. But the thing about it was, in general, is that when you died and had your ashes poured into the Ganges River, if you were a Shudra, which was a laborer or one of the lower castes, and you had led a really, really good life, you would be reincarnated as another person in a class above you. If you led a bad life, you would be reincarnated as a class below. Well, the problem was that these people down here at the bottom, the Dalits, were also known as the untouchables, right? So this system created a very, very strict, rigid Indian society that the British actually tried to come in and destroy so that they could actually allow people to move throughout a little bit. They're also going to improve roads and infrastructure and things like that. They're going to even try to improve women's place in society. One thing that the British are going to outlaw is the practice of sati. Now, sati is spelled S-U-T-T-E-E, is when literally if a woman's husband died, it was considered in Indian society that she is better off being dead with him rather than still living. And so sati was a practice practiced in some small Indian communities where a woman would jump on the funeral pyre of her husband and burn to death with him, right? So the thing about it is the British try to come in and outlaw this practice as well. But the thing about it is, in the long run, regardless of how good or bad the British thought these things were, it's not their culture to decide to outlaw these things, right? But the big one that the actual upper class Indian people actually benefited off of was the improvement of roads and the influx of cash, right? So going into it though as well, things are going to dramatically change though right around 1850 when the British begin to directly colonize land following the development of quinine medicine, following the development of the larger scale breech loading rifles and mini-ball rifled weapons and things like that, and they're going to start forcing Christian laws on people. They're going to start burning down and deforesting Indian land for fields. And a lot of this has to do with the blowback of the 7 Years' War, right? So the 7 Years' War that took place in the mid-1700s, what's going to happen is the British are going to beat the French. Some fighting is going to actually happen in India, and the British are going to be then unopposed in India, right? Once they beat the French and the French East India Company folded, and then they fought the Dutch East India Company off, the British began a direct attempt to take over the entirety of the Indian subcontinent, which is 20 times larger than the country of Britain itself, right? They go in there and they start burning down and deforesting land in India for fields, particularly to grow 2 things. One, in southern India, opium, of which they will begin to give to the Chinese, and 2, they started growing a lot of cotton to put it into their textile mills and the industrial mills that are back in Great Britain, right? They also began to look the other way when Indians began to starve by means of famine, right? They also began to draft native Indians as sepoys into their actual like government and also into their military. They begin to force men like right here. This man is an Indian sepoy who's following behind a British officer right there who has been forced to fight for the British and given guns by the British and forced to actually suppress other Indian rebellions, right? The British then begin to dethrone local princes, strip their lands. They force their workers to farm cash crops like cotton, tea, and opium, which is going to cause a famine because they're not farming, food, right? Literally, you can see the results of this in some of these pictures of famines that actually broke out in the 1870s in India. As you can see, these are people that have been ravaged by the Great Famine in the 1870s in India, right? So going into it, though, as you can tell, this is also going to create a very, very large system of direct rule. The British Raj is then going to take over in 1858 because literally, something we'll talk about in class, demonstrated how the East India Company literally let a rebellion break out on their hands because of course these people are going to rebel against the British during this like terrible treatment. So the British Raj is going to take over in 1858 and they referred to all of this stuff as their crown jewel. They referred to India as the crown jewel in their empire, right? So going into it as well, you have to understand that there are going to be massive reactions to imperialism, right? So something that you need to understand is that not all Europeans condoned or were okay with the imperialist practices of the British, of the Belgians, or anyone like that. For example, these two individuals were pioneers in the attempt to try and help people that were actually being imperialized, right? Because they felt as though we being Europeans will be the only people that can stop these other Europeans from doing the things that they're doing, right? We will help try and actually galvanize public opinion and get people to look at the imperialism for what it is, a genuine evil. And these two people are E.D. Morel, right? E.D. Morel being right here, and a man by the name of Roger Casemont. Now, Roger Casemont is actually also Irish, so he's got two dogs in this fight, and he believes that Ireland should be liberated from British control. Now, E.D. Morel and Roger Casemont started this thing known as the Congo Reform Association, right? They actually saw and witnessed all of the goods coming in through Belgian ports, and E.D. Morel did the math and realized there's no way, given how many people in Belgium they are sending to Africa, there's no possible way. There's no possible way that they're bringing all these goods out without using slavery, right? And actually forcing the Congolese people to go out there and harvest all this rubber, harvest all this ivory, or mine all of these like precious metals, right? So E.D. Morel and Roger Casemont founded this thing called the Congo Reform Association, where they also created a newspaper called the West African Press. And their exposure of slave systems by Leopold II to the entirety of the continent of Europe and the Congo is going to lead to it being stripped away from Leopold and turned over to the Belgian government, right? This also, though, as well, is going to have violent revolts are going to be a big thing about it as a reaction to imperialism as well. Now, the violent revolts, though, will mostly be by people that were being imperialized, right? So we are going to talk, when we get back in class, when I see y'all again in the next class, we're going to talk about the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, and we're going to talk about the Boxer Rebellion of 1899. Now, these two revolts are going to demonstrate to you that the people being imperialized, in this situation, the Indians and the Chinese, are going to violently try to repress the foreign invasion of these Europeans at the cost of a lot of lives, all right? So we'll talk about that soon. I'll see y'all in the class next time. Y'all have a good one.